My son thought he was a master performer, tearfully describing his terminal diagnosis over dinner. As an ex-accountant, I saw the holes in his story instantly. He wanted my house and my savings to drown his debts. I should have walked away, but one look at my grandkids, Leo and Maya, and my heart won over my head. I signed the power of attorney just to stay close to them, walking straight into his trap. Now, we're driving toward the state line, and he has my passport. Stay with me until the end to see how I turn the tables, and subscribe for more. I watched the steam rise from the Christmas ham, curling into the warm air like smoke signals from a funeral pyre. Kevin leaned forward into the candlelight, his face arranged in an expression I'd seen 1,000 times in interrogation footage, the performance of sincerity by someone who'd rehearsed their lies in a mirror. Stage 4, Ma. His voice cracked on cue, a hairline fracture of emotion that would have fooled anyone who hadn't spent 30 years reading the microtales of men who moved cocaine by the shipping container. The oncologist says I've got maybe 18 months. 2 years if the chemo works. I kept my hands folded on the table, feeling the linen napkin starch against my fingertips. Across the room, Leo and Maya were destroying a mountain of wrapping paper, their laughter punctuating Kevin's tragedy like a laugh track on the wrong channel. Dr. Miller said. Kevin's hand trembled as he reached for his wine glass. The Rolex on his wrist caught the light. I noted the slight stutter in the second-hand sweep. High-end replica. Maybe $1,500 to look like $15,000. He said I need to get my affairs in order. Dr. Miller, I repeated softly, letting the name sit between us like a chess piece I was considering. Right. Kevin's eyes were wet now, genuine tears summoned by whatever method actor trick he'd taught himself. He's at Northwestern. The oncology wing. He's the best, Ma, but even he says, his voice broke again, and he covered his face with one hand. I let the silence stretch. In the kitchen, the ice maker chunked out another load. The Christmas tree lights blinked in their programmed rhythm, 3 seconds on, 1 second off. I'd counted it earlier while setting the table. That's why I need to ask you something. Kevin lowered his hand. His pupils were dilated, but not from grief. From adrenaline. From the chemical cocktail of someone about to execute a plan. I need you to come live with me. At the villa. I can take care of you, and you can. He reached across the table, his fingers closing around mine with a pressure that was just slightly too firm. You can help me with the kids. While I still can. The villa. Oak Park. $3.2 million of leveraged optimism built during the real estate boom, currently hemorrhaging equity in a cooling market. I'd checked the county assessor's website last month out of habit, the same way I used to check flight manifests and shell company registrations. Kevin's suburban villa development project had sold exactly 2 units in 18 months. I don't want to be a burden, I said, and I let my voice waver just enough. An old woman's uncertainty. A mother's fear of becoming a weight around her son's neck. You're not a burden, Ma. He squeezed my hand harder. You're everything. But I need to know you're safe. That the house is taken care of. That everything is. He trailed off, his gaze sliding to the paperwork beside the gravy boat. The power of attorney documents. Cream-colored cardstock. Professionally prepared. The ink still smelled faintly of toner. Dr. Milton said. Kevin caught himself, his face flickering with something too quick to name. Dr. Miller. Sorry. The meds make me fuzzy. Dr. Miller became Dr. Milton. Then back again. I didn't blink. I just watched the candlelight reflect in his wet, dishonest eyes, and I felt something inside me that I'd kept carefully dormant for nearly 3 decades begin to wake up. The warmth of the dining room evaporated like water on hot asphalt. In its place came the cold, predatory stillness, that particular frequency of awareness I hadn't allowed myself to access since I'd walked into a federal safe house in San Diego with a briefcase full of cartel ledgers and a new last name. My pulse remained steady. 60 beats per minute. I'd checked it this morning during my yoga routine, the same way I checked it every morning, monitoring my body like it was a machine that required calibration. But my mind shifted into a different mode entirely, a clinical audit of the room that had nothing to do with Christmas ham or family warmth. Kevin wasn't my son right now. He was a liability in a power suit that pulled too tight across his midsection, broadcasting his stress in the gap between the third and fourth button. His cologne, something expensive and citrusy, couldn't quite mask the smell of his sweat. His hairline had receded another quarter-inch since Thanksgiving. The comb-over was more aggressive, sprayed into submission with enough product to survive a wind tunnel. The mother persona, the woman who baked snickerdoodles and wore beige wool cardigans and said things like, "Oh my," when the news mentioned tax fraud, retreated behind a firewall of forensic logic. The black accountant was back online. I looked at the gold Rolex on his wrist again, this time not as a concerned mother but as an investigator cataloging assets. The second hand didn't sweep, it ticked in microscopic stutters. Genuine Rolex movements are smooth as silk. This one had the telltale hesitation of a well-made Chinese clone. Kevin was presenting wealth he didn't have, which meant he was either underwater or circling the drain. I knew the Chicago real estate market had cooled. I read the Tribune's business section every morning with my coffee, the same way I used to read cartel shipping manifests, looking for patterns, for the negative space between what was said and what was true. Kevin's suburban villa project was bleeding him dry. I could see it in the tightness around his mouth, in the way he'd checked his phone 6 times during dinner, each glance quick and furtive like a man watching his margin calls multiply. He didn't have cancer. He had a liquidity crisis. Every sob he choked out was a calculated attempt to liquidate my safety net to cover his own sloppy greed. He was a predator, yes, he'd inherited that from me, the same way he'd inherited his father's weak chin and tendency toward acid reflux. But he was an amateur predator, unaware that his prey had spent a lifetime moving billions for men much more dangerous than him. Men who didn't fumble the names of fictional oncologists. Men who would have put a bullet in his skull for wasting their time with such a clumsy play. Across the room, Leo launched a foam dart at Maya's head. She shrieked and tackled him into the pile of wrapping paper, both of them tangling in ribbon and tissue like puppies in a box. My heart didn't ache at the sight. It hardened. Those children were my legacy. The only clean ledger I had left in a life built on laundered money and false identities. Leo had my steel gray eyes. Maya had my sharp chin and the way I used to tilt my head when calculating compound interest in my head. If I exposed Kevin now, if I stood up from this table and told him I knew he was lying, that I could see the amateur con job like a neon sign in a dark window, he would spiral. And when men like Kevin spiral, they don't go down alone. They grab whatever's closest and drag it into the hole with them. The collateral damage would bury those children. They'd lose their father to prison or bankruptcy or whatever hole desperate men crawl into when their schemes collapse. They'd lose their grandmother, because Kevin would burn me out of spite, ensure I never saw them again. They'd grow up in the wreckage, learning that family was just another word for people who destroyed each other over money. I couldn't let that happen. To protect them, I couldn't just win. I had to control the board. I needed to see exactly how far Kevin was willing to go, what debts he'd accumulated, what moves he'd planned, what assets he thought he could strip from me, so I could ensure he never went that far again. I needed to stay close. Even if it meant walking into the trap. Oh, Kevin. I let my voice tremble, a rehearsed fragility that would have made a stage actress jealous. I'd practiced it in the mirror last week when the first warning signs appeared, Kevin's sudden interest in my estate planning, his questions about whether I'd updated my will, his casual mention that some seniors found power of attorney arrangements gave them peace of mind. I reached for the documents beside the gravy boat, my hands shaking just enough to be convincing. Not enough to smudge the ink. Not enough to suggest anything other than an old woman overwhelmed by her son's tragedy and her own encroaching irrelevance. The paper felt expensive under my fingertips. 20-pound stock. Watermarked. Kevin had spent money on this presentation, which meant he was committed. Which meant he'd already calculated the return on investment and decided I was worth the cost of good stationery. I picked up the pen, a Mont Blanc, I noted, probably purchased with a credit card he couldn't afford to pay off, and positioned it over the signature line. "You'll take care of everything?" I asked, looking up at him with a gaze I'd perfected over decades of pretending to be harmless. Watery. Confused. The eyes of a woman who'd stopped being able to track the numbers, who needed someone younger and sharper to handle the complicated business of living. "Everything, Ma. I promise." Kevin's smile was the dazzle, all teeth and zero warmth, the expression of a man who'd just closed a deal and could already taste the commission. I signed the line with the precise, architectural print I used for my WITSEC filings. Each letter exactly 4 millimeters tall. Each stroke deliberate. The same signature that had appeared on immunity agreements and witness statements and the deed to this house that Kevin now believed he controlled. I was handing him the keys to my kingdom. But I was also attaching a GPS tracker to his soul. The ink was still wet when Kevin reached across the table and slid the documents toward himself, his fingers moving with the speed of someone who'd been waiting for this moment, rehearsing it, dreaming of it. He thought he'd just fleeced a confused old woman. He didn't realize he'd just invited a forensic auditor into his crime scene. I adjusted my glasses with one finger, a gesture I'd cultivated because it made me look older, more fragile, the kind of woman who needed help reading restaurant menus and couldn't possibly understand complex financial instruments. "You'll take care of everything, won't you?" I repeated, my voice soft and thready. "The taxes, the utilities. I just can't keep track of the numbers anymore." It was almost true. I couldn't keep track of the numbers the way normal people did, writing them in checkbook registers, balancing statements with a calculator and a cup of coffee. I kept track of numbers the way a musician keeps track of a symphony, holding entire compositions in my head, hearing the harmonies and dissonances without needing to see the sheet music. Kevin's smile widened. "Don't worry about any of that. I'll handle it all. You just focus on getting settled at the villa. It'll be good for you, Ma. Fresh start. And the kids," he glanced toward Leo and Maya, who were now constructing some kind of fort out of couch cushions. "They'll love having you there." The documents disappeared into his briefcase. Italian leather. Another tell. Kevin dressed like a man who'd already spent the money he was trying to steal. "We need to move fast, Ma." Kevin was already standing, his chair scraping against the hardwood with a sound like nails on slate. "The clinic in California has a bed opening Monday." "Dr. Miller," he caught himself again, a micro-expression of irritation crossing his face. "He arranged it. Experimental treatment. But we need to get you settled first. California. Not Oak Park. Not the villa 3 miles away where he claimed he wanted me close. California. 3 time zones and 2,000 miles from everything I knew, from the neighbors who'd watched me garden for 30 years, from the church ladies who knew my voice, from any witnesses who might ask questions if I suddenly disappeared. Kevin moved toward the hallway, and I followed, my gait measured and careful, the walk of a woman whose bones had started to feel the weight of decades. He watched me like a hawk as I packed, standing in the doorway of my bedroom with his arms crossed, his eyes tracking every item I pulled from the closet. I reached for my heavy wool coat, the one I'd purchased in 1997 with cash at a second-hand shop in Des Moines. The bug-out coat. My fingers brushed the reinforced lining where I'd sewn 5 $100 bills and a backup flash drive into the hem using the kind of invisible stitching you learn when you need to hide things from men who cut people open to find hidden assets. The weight of it against my hip was a comfort. A insurance policy. The flash drive contained nothing Kevin would understand, just a list of account numbers and routing codes that looked like random strings of digits. But to someone who knew how to read them, they were a map to every shell company and offshore account I'd maintained as escape routes during my WITSEC years. I folded the coat neatly, draping it over my arm. Kevin didn't notice the extra half-pound of fabric, the slight stiffness in the hem. He was too busy checking his phone again, his thumb scrolling through what I assumed were bank balances or property listings or whatever digital ledger was currently showing him red numbers. We moved toward the foyer, my suitcase rolling behind me with a sound like distant thunder. The Christmas tree lights continued their programmed blink. Leo and Maya's laughter had faded. They were in the kitchen now, probably raiding the cookie jar I'd filled yesterday with snickerdoodles. Kevin held out his hand as we reached the door, his palm up, expectant. "Give me your phone, Ma." I looked at him, letting confusion color my expression. "My phone?" "The radiation." He said it smoothly, like he'd rehearsed this part too. "And the stress of the calls. Dr. Miller, Dr. Milton," he didn't even bother to correct himself this time. "Said you need total digital detox. No screens. No notifications. Just rest and healing." It was a classic isolation tactic. Sever the lifeline. Cut off communication with the outside world. Make the target dependent on a single source of information, the abuser, so reality becomes whatever the abuser says it is. I'd seen it used on cartel accountants who got too curious about where the money was really going. First you take their phones. Then their laptops. Then their car keys. Then their ability to verify anything independently. Then you have them. I didn't argue. I reached into my purse, a sensible leather bag I'd carried for 15 years, and pulled out my iPhone. The screen was cracked at the corner from when I'd dropped it last month in the grocery store parking lot. I'd never bothered to get it fixed. Hadn't seemed important. I handed it to Kevin, watching him slip it into his breast pocket with the satisfied smile of someone who just removed the last obstacle between himself and his goal. He was severing my lifeline. But a phone is only a tracking device if you're an amateur. For a ghost, it's just a weight. A liability. A thing that pings cell towers and leaves digital breadcrumbs for people who know how to read them. I had my internal ledgers memorized. I had $500 in cash sewn into my coat. I had 30 years of practice disappearing when I needed to. Kevin thought he was isolating me. He was actually setting me free. I walked out of my Chicago home for the last time, the December air biting at my cheeks like tiny knives. The cold smelled like snow and car exhaust and the distant smokiness of someone's fireplace. My breath came out in clouds that dissolved into the darkness. Kevin popped the trunk of his SUV, a black Escalade that probably cost $70,000 he didn't have, and I saw it as he lifted my suitcase. Tucked under a moving blanket, half hidden but not hidden enough, a "for sale" sign. Red and white. Professional. Already printed with a phone number and a realtor's smiling face. He hadn't even waited for me to leave the driveway before starting the liquidation process. The audacity of his sloppiness was almost insulting. If you're going to rob someone, at least have the professionalism to hide the evidence until the victim is out of sight. But Kevin wasn't a professional. He was a desperate man making desperate moves, and desperate men make mistakes. I filed the detail away in the mental ledger I was building. Kevin's timeline was aggressive. Which meant his debts were immediate. Which meant I had less time than I'd hoped to determine the full scope of his plan. I climbed into the passenger seat. The cabin smelled like Kevin's cologne, expensive, cloying, the scent of a man trying to cover up the smell of his own fear. The leather was cold against my back. The dashboard glowed with blue LED lights that hurt my eyes. Kevin slid into the driver's seat and started the engine. The Escalade roared to life with the kind of aggressive rumble that announces a man's presence before he arrives. We pulled out of the driveway. The Christmas lights on my house, lights I'd strung myself the day after Thanksgiving, standing on a ladder while Mrs. Patterson from next door shouted encouragement, disappeared behind us. We drove through the suburbs, past the houses with their wreaths and inflatable snowmen, past the park where I used to push Kevin on the swings when he was small, past the grocery store where I'd bought the ham we'd just eaten. I waited for Kevin to turn toward Oak Park. Toward the villa. Toward the story he'd sold me about living together, about caring for me, about being close to the grandchildren. Instead, he banked hard onto the I-55 heading south. A little detour, Ma. His voice was light, casual, the tone of someone mentioning they need to stop for gas. We're going to stay at a nice place near the airport tonight so we don't miss the flight tomorrow. He was lying. The I-55 didn't go to O'Hare or Midway. The I-55 was the vein that led to the rural fringes, to the places where the city's grip loosened and the landscape opened up into farmland and forgotten towns, places where a person could disappear into the machinery of state-funded care without anyone asking questions. I leaned my head against the cold glass and watched the city lights blur past. The vibration of the road hummed through my skull. I began counting the rhythms against my thigh, a habit from my WITSEC days, a way to stay calm and focused when everything was falling apart. 1, 2, 3, 4. Kevin reached into his breast pocket, ostensibly to adjust something, checking his reflection in the rearview mirror with the vanity of a man who still thought his appearance mattered. That's when I saw it. The corner of my blue passport, tucked behind his wallet. My passport. The one I kept in my safe deposit box at the bank, locked behind 2 keys and a signature card that required a notary to access. Kevin had raided my safe deposit box. Probably last Sunday, when I was at church singing hymns and pretending to care about the pastor's sermon on forgiveness. He must have forged my signature, or bribed someone, or simply used the power of attorney documents he'd prepared in advance, the ones I hadn't signed yet but that he'd probably backdated once he had my real signature. He wasn't just moving me. He was erasing my identity. By holding my travel documents, he controlled my ability to cross borders or verify my WITSEC status. Without that passport, I couldn't prove who I was to anyone who mattered, not the marshals, not the FBI, not the bankers who held my offshore accounts. He was building a cage out of bureaucracy, using the very system I'd once helped design to trap people who knew too much. Unaware that I was the one who designed the locks. The Chicago skyline became a cluster of distant, twinkling lights in the rearview mirror, shrinking with every mile we traveled. The buildings where I'd worked in my 20s, before the cartels, before the WITSEC, before I became someone else. The city where I'd raised Kevin, where I'd tried to be normal, where I'd baked cookies and attended PDA meetings and pretended I didn't know how to make a man disappear without leaving a trace. I sat in the predatory stillness, feeling it settle into my bones like an old friend I'd tried to forget. I began calculating. The distance to California, approximately 2,000 miles. Driving time, 30 hours, give or take, depending on stops. Kevin would need to sleep. He'd need to eat. Those would be my opportunities, small windows where his attention would slip, where I could gather more intelligence, where I could begin to understand the full architecture of his plan. I thought about his first Horizon accounts. I'd seen the statements last Thanksgiving when he'd left his briefcase open in my living room, and I'd photographed the papers with my phone while he was outside smoking. The accounts were leveraged to the breaking point. He'd taken cash advances against the real estate projects, probably telling himself it was temporary, that the market would recover, that he'd flip the properties and pay everything back before anyone noticed. But the market hadn't recovered. And now he was liquidating the only asset he could access, me. Kevin thought he was the architect of my demise, driving me towards some facility where I'd be declared incompetent and forgotten, where my assets would be transferred into his name and used to plug the holes in his sinking ship. But he was wrong. He wasn't the architect. He was just a courier, delivering me exactly where I needed to be to dismantle his life. I leaned my head against the cold glass and closed my eyes, listening to the rhythm of the road, feeling each bump and crack in the asphalt translate into a steady beat against my thigh. 1, 2, 3, 4. Counting. Calculating. Planning. The black accountant was back, and she was very, very patient. The clinic was a neon flickering lie. Kevin pulled the Escalade into a gravel lot that crunched under the tires like broken teeth. Through the windshield, I watched the sign, Valley Rest Inn, buzz and sputter, the letter R dying in electric spasms. The motel stretched before us in a long, low line of peeling stucco the color of old bone. California's Central Valley. The air here tasted different even through the sealed cabin, thick with pesticide and agricultural runoff, the kind of heat that doesn't cool even after the sun goes down. This wasn't Malibu. This wasn't even Bakersfield. This was the fly-blown fringe where people came to disappear. Kevin killed the engine. In the sudden silence, I heard the industrial hum of an air conditioning unit struggling against the heat, the distant yap of a dog chained somewhere in the darkness. Just a temporary stop, Ma. Kevin's voice had shifted into that greasy, salesman's charm he used when he was closing a deal he knew was rotten. We'll rest here tonight, get you settled before the morning flight. There was no flight. I'd known at the moment we hit the I-55 south, but now the confirmation solidified in my chest like ice forming on a lake. I watched a fly die against the windshield, its body making a tiny percussion against the glass. One moment struggling, the next moment still. That's what this place was, a transit point for the soon-to-be-forgotten, a holding cell disguised as temporary lodging. The only medical presence was a rusted van in the corner of the lot, its white paint oxidized to the color of dirty chalk. No Red Cross. No company logo. Just a cargo van with blackened windows and a rear bumper held on with bungee cords. Kevin wasn't just hiding me. He was burying me in the margins of the map, in a place where no one would think to look, where the neighbors didn't know each other's names and the front desk clerk wouldn't remember my face even if you showed him a photograph. Come on. Kevin was already out of the SUV, moving around to my door with a speed that betrayed his eagerness. Let's get you inside. You must be exhausted. I wasn't exhausted. My body felt coiled and alert, every nerve ending cataloging information, the smell of hot asphalt and dying agriculture, the sound of Spanish-language radio bleeding from a room 2 doors down, the texture of the air itself, thick and syrupy with humidity. But I played the part. I moved slowly, allowing Kevin to take my elbow as I stepped down from the Escalade. My knees cracked audibly, a gift of age I didn't have to fake. The room was number 7. Kevin had already checked in, already had the key card. The door opened with a magnetic click that sounded too loud in the thick night air. The smell hit me first. Industrial cleaner, the kind that doesn't actually clean, just masks the scent of everything underneath. Mildew. Old smoke. The ghost of 1,000 temporary residents who'd slept in these sheets and moved on. I tested the perimeter immediately. It's an instinct you don't lose, even after 30 years of pretending to be someone else. You enter a space and immediately catalog the exits, the sightlines, the vulnerabilities. The room was small, one queen bed with a polyester comforter the color of rust, a nightstand bolted to the floor, a bathroom visible through a half-open door where fluorescent light flickered like a dying heartbeat. One window. Painted shut, I noted, seeing the layers of beige paint sealing the frame. One door. Currently open, Kevin blocking the threshold with his body. I need some fresh air, I said, reaching for my purse where I'd set it on the bed. My voice had the right tremor, the fragility of a woman whose nerves were frayed. Just a quick walk. Clear my head after all that driving. I took 2 steps toward the door. A man stepped into the frame, blocking my path. He was large, not tall, but thick through the chest and shoulders, the kind of bulk that came from manual labor rather than gym memberships. He wore a stained polo shirt with a logo I didn't recognize, khaki pants that had seen better days. His knuckles were calloused, scarred. The hands of someone who'd worked construction or farming, someone who knew how to use physical force when words weren't enough. He didn't speak. He just loomed, a wall of cheap muscle and professional indifference. "Doctor's orders, Mrs. Miller." Kevin's voice came from behind me, and I noted the name change immediately. I wasn't Martha anymore. I was Mrs. Miller, a fictional woman with a fictional diagnosis and a fictional need for supervision. "You're a fall risk. Can't have you wandering around at night." The orderly, because that's what he was, hired muscle dressed up in medical terminology, shifted his weight. I heard the creak of the floorboards under his feet, noted the slight drag of his right foot. An old injury, maybe. Or just laziness. I turned back toward the room, letting my shoulders slump in defeat. Behind me, I heard the click of the deadbolt. The sound of a closing trap. I wasn't just a guest in this motel. I was state-sanctioned cargo, held in a legal gray zone where Kevin's forged documents and purchased medical opinions had more weight than my own voice. I felt the familiar pressure of being hunted, that particular awareness that came from knowing someone wanted you contained, controlled, erased. But this time, the predator shared my DNA. This time, the man who wanted me gone had called me Ma over Christmas ham less than 24 hours ago. I sat down on the edge of the bed, feeling the mattress sag under my weight. The springs groaned. Through the thin walls, I heard the muffled sound of a television, canned laughter from a sitcom I didn't recognize. Kevin retreated to the bathroom, and I heard the sound of him humming, a jaunty, tuneless melody that echoed off the tile. The water ran. He was washing his hands, probably congratulating himself on a job well done. I moved with the silent, measured gait I'd perfected in 1997, when staying invisible meant staying alive. His briefcase sat on the polyester bedspread, maybe 2 feet from where I'd been sitting. Italian leather, brass hardware. Unlocked. Arrogance is a forensic accountant's best friend. I flicked it open with one finger, the catch releasing with a soft snick that was covered by the sound of running water and Kevin's off-key humming. Inside, folders, papers, the organized chaos of a man trying to manage multiple frauds simultaneously. I found it in the second folder. A wire transfer confirmation from First Horizon National Bank. The header was timestamped 2 days ago. December 23, 11:47 a.m. While I'd been at the grocery store buying ingredients for Christmas dinner, Kevin had been at a bank terminal executing a digital heist. Source account, Martha, redacted, 401k retirement fund destination account, KM Holdings LLC amount, $840,000 status, complete. My retirement. The money I'd accumulated over 30 years of careful, legal work after I'd left the cartels behind. The nest egg I'd built from substitute teaching and bookkeeping for local businesses, every dollar reported to the IRS, every transaction clean and traceable. Gone in a single digital stroke. He hadn't just stolen my present. He'd stolen my future. And the shell company, KM Holdings LLC, Kevin Miller Holdings, because he couldn't even be bothered to create a truly anonymous entity, was probably set up to funnel the money directly into his failing real estate projects. My retirement wasn't stolen for its own sake. It was being used as a down payment on his survival, a temporary patch on a hull that was taking on water faster than he could bail. I photographed the page with my eyes, committing every detail to memory. Account numbers. Routing codes. The name of the bank officer who'd processed the transaction. All of it filed away in the mental archive I'd maintained since my federal handler had taught me how to memorize evidence without leaving physical copies. Behind me, the water shut off. Kevin's humming grew louder. I closed the briefcase with the same careful silence I'd used to open it, my fingers never leaving prints on the brass hardware. By the time Kevin emerged from the bathroom, drying his hands on a thin white towel, I was sitting exactly where I'd been before, staring at the wall with the blank expression of a woman who'd given up. A knock at the door made the orderly shift his weight. 3 sharp raps, professional and impatient. Kevin moved past me to answer it, and I smelled his cologne again, that expensive citrus trying to cover the scent of his nervous sweat. Dr. Eris Thorne stepped into the room carrying a leather satchel that had probably cost more than the orderly's monthly salary. He was in his 50s, I estimated, with silver hair styled in a way that was meant to inspire confidence. Expensive suit. Tie pin. The kind of presentation that said, "Trust me, I'm a professional," while his eyes said something else entirely. He wore a smile as artificial as a plastic orchid. He didn't look at me, not at first. He looked at the clipboard Kevin handed him, scanning whatever fiction my son had prepared. Patient history. Symptoms. The narrative of my supposed decline into incompetence. I recognized the type immediately. I'd seen them in federal courtrooms, testifying for whichever side paid their retainer. Expert witnesses, whose expertise was flexible, whose opinions could be purchased like any other commodity. A cleaner for the corrupt. A man who sold signatures to the highest bidder. Mrs. Miller. Dr. Thorne finally turned his attention to me, his smile widening to show teeth that were too white, too perfect. Veneers. I'm Dr. Thorne. Your son asked me to conduct a wellness check. Just routine. Nothing to worry about. His wellness check was legal theater, a performance designed to strip me of my agency and transform me from a person into a problem that required institutional management. In the eyes of the law, Thorne was about to become the architect of my incompetence. His signature on the right forms would give Kevin the legal authority to make all medical decisions on my behalf, to commit me to whatever facility he chose, to ensure I never saw my grandchildren or my bank accounts again. I sat on the edge of the bed, smoothing my slacks with deliberate precision. The fabric was soft under my palms. Real wool, not polyester. A small detail, but details matter when you're building a performance. I prepared for my role. Dr. Thorne pulled a chair from the corner, cheap plastic, the kind that belonged in a community center, not a medical evaluation, and positioned himself in front of me. Close enough to be authoritative, far enough to maintain professional distance. He clicked his pen. The sound was sharp in the humid air. I'm going to ask you some questions, Mrs. Miller. Just answer as best you can. There are no right or wrong answers here. The lie was smooth, practiced. Of course there were right answers. The right answers would get me declared competent. The wrong answers would get me committed. Let's start simple. Can you tell me what day it is? Tuesday, I said. It was actually Wednesday, but close enough to suggest confusion without seeming totally detached from reality. Thorne made a note. And what month? December. I let my gaze drift to the window, where the neon sign cast pink and blue shadows across the parking lot. Christmas was, yesterday? Or... I trailed off, furrowing my brow as if trying to grasp something just out of reach. Another note. His pen scratched against the paper with a sound like insects. Very good. Now, I'm going to say 3 words, and I'd like you to remember them. In a few minutes, I'll ask you to repeat them back to me. The words are, apple, table, penny. I nodded, letting my eyes go slightly unfocused. Thorne continued with more questions. Who was the president? How to count backward from 100 by 7s. Simple tasks designed to measure cognitive function, to separate the sharp from the declining. I underperformed with surgical precision. When he asked me to repeat the 3 words, I let a long, hollow silence hang in the humid air. I blinked at him, my expression caught somewhere between distress and emptiness. There was. I started, then stopped. Looked at the ceiling. Apple? Was one of them apple? I gave him exactly what he wanted, a confused old woman who couldn't hold 3 nouns in her head for 5 minutes. A woman whose memory was failing, whose grip on reality was slipping, who clearly needed professional intervention. But I was careful. I missed just enough questions to ensure he'd signed the commitment papers, but not so many that I appeared catatonic or nonverbal. Too far gone and I'd be flagged for hospitalization. Too competent and Kevin's plan would collapse. It was a tightrope walk, and I'd spent 30 years walking tightropes. To beat a man like Thorne, you must first feed his ego. You must let him believe he's seeing through you, that his professional judgment has correctly identified a deteriorating mind. You must give him the conclusion he came here to reach, so he can leave feeling like he's done his job rather than questioning whether he's participating in a crime. Thorne clicked his pen again, this time with finality. "Thank you, Mrs. Miller. You've been very helpful." He stood, smoothing his expensive suit, and turned to Kevin. They moved toward the corner of the room, speaking in low voices I was clearly meant to overhear. Moderate cognitive impairment. Disorientation to time. Memory deficits. I'd recommend immediate placement in a supervised setting. Thorne's voice had the practiced neutrality of someone delivering a diagnosis he'd written before he ever knocked on the door. Kevin's response was quieter, but I caught the words, commitment papers, and, tomorrow morning. When Thorne stepped out, briefcase in hand, another job completed, another signature sold, Kevin turned his phone toward me. The screen glowed in the dim light of the motel room. A video, already playing. Sound tinny through the small speakers. Leo and Maya, running through a park I recognized from Kevin's neighborhood. Autumn leaves scattered across grass that was still green despite the season. Maya's laugh was high and bright, carrying across whatever distance separated the phone's camera from the children. Leo was chasing her with a stick, both of them wrapped in jackets against the Chicago cold. "They miss you, Ma." Kevin's voice dropped, losing the salesman's brightness and taking on something darker, more jagged. A threat wrapped in nostalgia. "They keep asking when you're coming back. When they can see Grandma again." He paused the video, freezing Maya mid-laugh. "But if you cause trouble." He let the sentence hang, watching my face for reaction. "If you try to call anyone, or make a scene, or tell some nurse that you're being held against your will." His finger hovered over the screen. "They'll forget what you look like. I'll make sure of it. I'll move. New school. New city. You'll never find them." It was the leash. The one weakness he could exploit, the one vulnerability I couldn't firewall behind forensic logic and predatory stillness. He knew, had always known, that I wouldn't burn the world if it meant the smoke would choke my grandchildren. He was using my only remaining attachment as a gag, ensuring my silence by holding their faces hostage. I looked at the frozen image. Maya's mouth open in joy. Leo's hair wild in the wind. My legacy. My only clean ledger. "I understand," I whispered, and I meant it. Kevin smiled. He pocketed the phone, satisfied that he'd secured my cooperation. He didn't realize that by showing me the weapon, he'd also shown me exactly what I needed to protect. That by making the threat explicit, he'd given me a target to aim for once I broke free. I noticed the blue light first, a small LED glow coming from behind the nightstand, partially hidden by the lamp's base. A signal jammer. Plugged directly into the wall outlet, broadcasting its interference field in a radius I estimated at maybe 30 feet. Every Wi-Fi signal, every cellular connection, every digital lifeline scrambled into useless noise. Kevin was thorough in his panic. My Cartier watch ticked on my wrist, its mechanical movement immune to electronic interference. It told me the time, 8:47 p.m., but it couldn't call for help. Couldn't send an email. Couldn't ping a cell tower or access the cloud. The room was now a Faraday cage for my soul. Every standard channel of escape had been neutralized. Phone, confiscated. Internet, jammed. Door, locked and guarded. Window, painted shut. Even if I screamed, the orderly would just claim I was having an episode, that Dr. Thorne had already documented my deteriorating mental state. I watched the orderly's silhouette through the thin curtain, a dark blotch against the amber glow of the parking lot lights. He was leaning against the railing, arms crossed. Waiting. Patient in the way of men who are paid by the hour. I was stripped of my phone, my money, except for the $500 sewn into my coat, and my voice. Left with nothing but the contents of my bug-out coat and my mind. But my mind had moved billions. My mind had built untraceable financial networks that had survived FBI audits and cartel investigations. My mind had memorized routing codes and shell company registrations that didn't exist on any server Kevin could access. I sat on the bed, feeling the sag of the mattress, and began to calculate. For one heartbeat, maybe two, I considered the emergency protocols. Code Black. 2 words that would trigger the full weight of the United States Marshal Service. I could scream them to any law enforcement officer, any federal employee, and the machine would activate. Within hours, I'd be extracted, relocated, given a new identity in a new city with new handlers. But the ledger of my life was still stained. The cartel I'd betrayed in 1996, La Corporación, they'd called themselves, a network that moved cocaine by the ton and eliminated witnesses with industrial efficiency, had long memories. If I triggered a WITSEC alarm, if my name appeared in federal databases again, their recovery teams would see the flare. They had people everywhere. In law enforcement. In government offices. In the very system designed to protect me. Calling the law would bring the ghosts of 1996 back to my doorstep, and this time I didn't have a safe house to run to. This time I had Leo and Maya to protect, and the cartel's favorite tactic was to hurt the people their targets loved most. I couldn't risk it. I had to solve this numerically, within the system Kevin had built, without leaving a trace that would attract attention from anyone, law enforcement or otherwise. I had to become invisible again, but this time on my own terms. I had to dismantle Kevin's life using nothing but the tools he'd left within my reach. Kevin's phone buzzed on the nightstand. He'd set it down while washing his face in the bathroom, the sound of running water covering the notifications chime. I saw the preview on the lock screen before it faded. Chicago Premier Realty, property sold. Closing complete. Funds dispersed to seller account ending in 4782. My home. The one with the pine-scented foyer and the Christmas tree I'd decorated myself. The house where I'd raised Kevin, where I'd taught him to ride a bike and helped him with his algebra homework. The house where Leo and Maya had spent Christmas morning opening presents. Gone. Sold in less than 48 hours, probably at a price well below market value to facilitate a quick close. Kevin was burning my life to the ground to keep his own warm, liquidating every asset he could touch to plug the holes in his sinking financial ship. I felt the surge of predatory stillness, cold and sharp as a blade made of ice. He wasn't just taking my money. He was attempting to delete me. To erase every trace of my existence, to transform me from a person into a problem that could be filed away in some state institution and forgotten. But Kevin had forgotten a fundamental rule of accounting, one I'd taught him myself when he was 12 years old and trying to hide a bad report card by throwing it away. You can't delete a transaction without leaving a ghost in the machine. Every wire transfer has a source and a destination. Every property sale has a deed and a title search. Every shell company has incorporation papers and registered agents. Kevin thought he was covering his tracks. He was actually building a trail I could follow, a paper chain that would lead directly from his desperation to his downfall. I just needed to access the machine. I began to audit the orderly. It's what I do. What I've always done. You watch a person long enough, you see the patterns emerge. The rhythms. The vulnerabilities. Every 2 hours, the floorboards outside creaked with his weight. Heavy footsteps, heel first, dragging the right toe slightly. An old injury, or just the gait of a man who'd stopped caring about posture decades ago. He'd step onto the balcony. I'd hear the scrape of the metal lighter, the first exhale of smoke. The scent would waft through the poorly sealed doorframe, cheap menthol cigarettes, the kind you buy at gas stations in soft packs. He stayed out for exactly 6 minutes. I'd timed it 3 times now, counting the seconds on my mechanical watch. 360 seconds. Enough time to smoke a cigarette down to the filter and check his phone. That was my window. 6 minutes to move. To act. To transform from prisoner to ghost. I memorized the rhythm of his footsteps when he returned, the creak of the third floorboard from the left, the slight scuff of his right foot dragging across the threshold. He was lazy. Bored. Predictable. Predictability is a vulnerability, and I intended to exploit it the same way I'd exploited every other weakness in every other system I'd ever audited. The orderly thought he was guarding a confused old woman who couldn't remember 3 words in a row. He had no idea he was guarding a wolf who'd spent 30 years pretending to be a sheep. "I'll just tidy up a bit," I muttered, playing the grandmotherly role to perfection. My voice had the querulous quality of someone trying to maintain dignity in an undignified situation. Dr. Thorne was packing his leather satchel, organizing his papers with the brisk efficiency of a man who had 3 more evaluations to conduct tonight. Kevin was in the bathroom again. He had a nervous bladder, I'd noticed, another tell of his anxiety. Thorne's security badge slipped from his pocket as he bent to zip the satchel. A laminated rectangle on a lanyard, tumbling silently onto the thin industrial carpet. I moved with the grace I'd perfected over decades of staying invisible. My foot covered the badge before Thorne straightened. A simple shift of weight, nothing dramatic. Just an old woman settling her stance. Oh dear. I fumbled in my pocket for a tissue, the clean white handkerchief I'd carried since this morning, when my life was still my own. Dropped something. I bent slowly, making a show of my age, my stiffness. The tissue fell from my fingers, accidentally on purpose, landing next to my foot. When I picked it up, the badge was palmed, pressed against my palm by the tissue's folds. By the time I straightened, the badge was sliding into the reinforced lining of my coat, finding a home next to the $500 and the flash drive. A small addition to my arsenal, but in the right context, a security badge was a skeleton key to institutional doors. Thorne never noticed. He was already heading for the exit, already thinking about his next appointment, his next signature, his next paycheck. "Take care, Mrs. Miller," he said without looking back. A small tool, yes. But I'd built empires with smaller. Kevin stood, straightening his suit jacket with the same preening gesture he'd used at Christmas dinner. Checking his appearance. Making sure the presentation was perfect even when the substance was rotten. "I'll be back in the morning with the final placement papers, Ma." His voice was businesslike now, the emotional manipulation set aside in favor of logistical efficiency. "Get some rest. Tomorrow's a big day." He didn't hug me. Didn't kiss my forehead or take my hand or offer any gesture of filial affection. He just walked out, the door clicking shut behind him with a sound like a vault locking. The orderly took his post on the balcony. I heard the scrape of his lighter, smelled the first bloom of menthol smoke. I was alone in a room that smelled of industrial cleaner and the accumulated desperation of 1,000 temporary residents. The fluorescent bathroom light flickered. The air conditioning unit hummed and rattled. Somewhere down the row of rooms, a baby was crying. Martha the mother was gone. There was only the accountant now, sitting in the dark with Dr. Thorne's stolen security badge in her coat and $840,000 worth of rage crystallizing into strategy. I checked my watch. 9:34 p.m. The orderly would smoke for 6 minutes, then return to his post. At 11:34, he'd smoke again. And again at 1:34 a.m. I sat on the edge of the bed, my hands folded in my lap, and began calculating the exact moment the orderly would light his next cigarette. The game had changed. Kevin thought he'd trapped me. He'd actually just given me a laboratory to study his vulnerabilities, a 6 by 10 foot incubator where I could plan his destruction without interruption. I leaned back against the headboard, feeling the cheap polyester of the bedspread against my shoulders, and closed my eyes. Not to sleep. To count. If you made it to this moment, thank you for listening all the way through. Most people bail before the bill comes due. But here, the bill always comes due. What started as humiliation and disrespect ended with receipts, truth, and a payoff they never saw coming. If you want more stories where karma shows up without mercy, hit subscribe and come back for the next one. Now tell me in the comments, what was the most disgusting thing they did? What crossed the line for you?